and welcome to another Sunday edition of Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. Hope everyone's having a really good night and a wonderful weekend whenever you're getting a chance to watch this. I'm Joel K. This is Accessibly Live, book club reading room, where we read public domain books, and we read the whole thing, not in one sitting, because God knows you guys will kill me if I'm doing this for 3.5, 4 hours or longer. So we break this down into 4 chapters, sometimes 3 chapters a night, and we go through the entire book for week per week. And we're doing something a little different. We're starting something early. Next Sunday, the 26th of January, is our 2-year anniversary. And what we're going to be doing tonight is starting our anniversary a little bit early. The reason why is that in February, when we would normally still be reading the book, I have something very special for Valentine's Day for everybody. I have a love story that will transcend time. And I know I'm not talking about Ghost. I'm talking about something older than Patrick Swayze's Ghost. Another Ghost. The Ghost and Mrs. Muir will be premiering through the Valentine's Day week here on the Book Club Reading Room. And it's a nice love story. It is another black and white movie done in the early 30s. And it is a fun story when, well, you buy a house and you expect a few problems and, well, you get a ghost along with it. The ghost of an old sea captain who is haunting their old home, as it were. And that will be coming up on Valentine's Day week this year. And I'm excited to present it for you guys. No commercial interruptions. We will play it all the way through. It's about an hour and 35 minutes. And it is a very good movie from beginning to end. So this coming Valentine's Day, we have something special. We'll talk more about it on Thursday edition of the show, of the Conversation Station, and we'll talk more about it next week. But tonight, we are starting early. We are starting The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. This story is part of the public domain of all the Hardy Boys that are now in existence. Hardy Boys have been around as long as I have. Actually, they've been around longer. They are probably one of the preeminent mystery novels for young adults. I read them. I read about 24 of them, maybe 3 growing up, and they were a lot of fun to read. And they're good enjoyment, good suspense. The guys who created these did a really good job. I mean, the Hardy Boys were first published in 1927 by Edward Stratemeyer, founder of the Stratemeyer Syndicate. Now, there were many ghostwriters creating the stories of the 2 mystery-solving brothers, including noted Canadian writer, novelist Charles L. McFarlane. There were a total of 190 books featuring the young detective, starting in 1927 to its finish in 2005. The series' first 50 novels are considered to be canon to the stories. Now, there were many other interpretations to the books, many other groups getting together and creating more of the Hardy Boys. In fact, during the 1970s, there was a television series that I believe lasted 2 seasons, The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew Mysteries. And it was not a bad series, but it was very condensed and very quickened to the denouement, the climax of the show or the mystery. Nothing like the books, not at all. So, before we get into the book, remind everybody, if you get a chance to like and subscribe, hit the button. I would greatly appreciate it. We are here to read and have a little bit of fun and to, just have a nice chill evening. Every evening here on Accessibly Live Book Club Reading Room, we read just like you did when you guys were going to the library and the librarian would read to you, sit you in a circle, and they would read stories to you and occasionally show you pictures. There are no pictures in these books, but there is. But there's really no way to show the pictures to you, unfortunately. The stories are a lot of fun, and I hope you guys sit back, enjoy them. Just turn off the lights, kick back in your favorite chair. If you're doing some gaming, turn down the gaming. You've probably done the game enough. You know what the sound effects are. And turn up the sound and let me read. And we're going to get started with the Hardy Boys. The House on the Cliff. Chapter 1. The Haunted House. 3 powerful motorcycles sped along the shore road that leads from the city of Bayport, skirting Beaumont Bay on the Atlantic coast. It was a bright Saturday morning in June, and although the city sweltered in the heat, cool breezes blew in from the bay. 2 of the motorcycles carried an extra passenger. All the cyclists were boys about 15 and 16 years of age, and all 5 were students at the Bayport High School. They were enjoying their Saturday holiday by this outing, glad of the chance to get away from the torrid warmth of the city for a few hours. When the foremost motorcycle reached the place, the shore road formed a junction with another highway leading to the north. The rider brought his machine to a stop and waited for the others to draw alongside. He was tall, dark youth of 16 with a clever, good-natured face. His name was Frank Hardy. "Where do we go from here?" he called out to the others. The 2 remaining motorcycles came to stop, and the drivers mopped their brows while the 2 other boys dismounted, glad of the chance to stretch their legs. One of the cyclists, a boy of 15, fair with curly light hair, was Joe Hardy, the brother of Frank's, and the other lad was Chet Morton, the chum of the Hardy boys. The other youths were Jerry Gilroy, and Biff Hooper, typical healthy American lads of high school age. "You're the leader," said Joe to his brother. "We'll follow you." "I'd rather have it settled. We've started out without any particular place to go. There's not much fun of just riding around the countryside." "I don't care much about where we go, as long as we keep going," said Jerry. "We get a breeze as long as we're traveling, but the minute we stop, I begin to sweat." Chet Morton gazed at the long shore road. "I'll tell you what we can do," he said suddenly. "Let's go and visit the haunted house." "Palooka's place?" "Sure. We've never been out there." "I've passed it," Frank said, "but I didn't go very close to the place, I'll tell you." Jerry Gilroy, who was a newcomer to Bayport, looked puzzled. "Where is Palooka's place?" "You can see it from here. Look," said Chet, taking his by the arm and bringing him over to the side of the road. "See where the shore road dips away near the end of Beaumont Bay? You see the cliff?" "Yes. There is a stone house on the top." "Well, that's Palooka's place." "Who is Palooka?" "Who was Palooka, you mean," interjected Frank. "He used to live there, but he was murdered. And that's why the place is supposed to be haunted." "Reason enough, isn't it?" said Biff Hooper. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'll tell the world there are some funny stories going on around that house ever since Palooka was killed. He must have been a strange fellow, anyway, commented Jerry, to build a house in such that way. Indeed, the Palooka place had been built on an unusual site. High above the waters of the bay it stood, built close to the edge of a rocky and inhospitable cliff. There was some distance back from the road, and there was no other house within miles. The boys had traveled a little more than 3 miles since leaving Bayport, and the Palooka place was at least 5 miles away. It could hardly have been seen, but it had been for its prominent position on the cliff, silhouetted clearly against the sky. He was a strange fellow, Frank observed. No one knew very much about him. He didn't welcome visitors. In fact, he always kept a couple vicious dogs around the place, so nobody cared to hang around there if they weren't invited. He was a miser, came from Joe Hardy. He may have been. At least that was the theory. Everybody said Palooka had a lot of money, but after his death, there wasn't a nickel found in the house. Felix Palooka always said he wouldn't trust the banks, put in Biff Hooper. But if he had any money, I don't know where he made it, for he didn't work anywhere, anything, and he mighty seldom came into the city. Oh, I forgot to do something, guys. Hang on. There we go. So for those of you wondering what I'm doing here, I'm reading The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. Perhaps he inherited it, Jerry suggested. Maybe, but he must have had money at some time to build a house. That it's a great rambling stone place that must have cost thousands. Is anybody living there now? The others shook their heads. No one has lived there since the murder, and I don't think anyone ever will, said Frank Hardy. The house is too far out of the way, for one thing, and then the stories that have been going on around. Well, I won't say that I believe any place is haunted, but the Palooka place is certainly strange. There have been queer lights seen there at night, once stormy nights particularly, and once a motorcyclist had broken down near there, so he went up to the house for help. He didn't know anything about the history of the place. He got the scare of his life. What happened? He decided he then decided he decided when he went into the front yard that the place was deserted, and he was just going to turn around when he saw an old man standing on one of the upper windows looking at him. He called out, and the old man went away. And although the motorist hunted all through the house, he couldn't find a trace of the old chap. So he left the place as quickly as he could. I don't blame him, remarked Jerry. But the house sounds interesting. I'm game to visit. So am I, declared the others. Lead on, laughed Chet. It'll be a brave ghost that will tackle the whole 5 of us. Jerry clambered on behind Chet, and Biff mounted Joe's motorcycle. The machines roared, and the little cavalcade started on its way down the shore road toward the house on the cliff. Instead of being an aimless trip, the outing had now assumed all the aspects of an adventure. With the exception of Jerry, the boys had all passed by the Palooka place at one time or the other, but none had ever ventured off the main road to explore the deserted place. The lane leading to the Palooka grounds, never kept in good repair even during the owner's lifetime, was now almost indiscernible and overgrown with weeds and bushes. The house itself was hidden from the roadway by trees. Most people gave the place a wide berth, whether they believed in ghosts or not, for the stories that had been told of the rambling stone buildings since the murder of Felix Palooka 2 years before were efficient enough to indicate that there had been strange happenings in the old house. Whether or not they were supernatural origin was a matter of debate. The murder of Felix Palooka had been particularly brutal. He was old Italian, suspected, as Frank said, of being a miser. He was very eccentric in his ways, and most people considered that he was not quite mentally sound. Be that as it may, Bayport was shocked one morning to learn of the old man had been found dead in the kitchen of his house, his body riddled with bullets. The motive apparently was robbery, for although it was popularly believed that the old man possessed a great deal of money that he kept with him in the house, it was never found, in spite of the most diligent search. This was the gloomy history of the place the Hardy Boys and their chums were now about to visit and explore. To add the atmosphere of excitement that had possessed them from the moment of the old house was mentioned, as they drew closer to the cliff, the sun retired behind a cloud, and the sky gradually became darker. Frank glanced up. Although the sky had been bright and clear when the party left Bayport, clouds had gathered in the east, and it was plain that a storm was gathering. Looks as if we'll have to go into the Palooka place whether we want to or not, he called out to the others. It's going to rain. In a little while, they came to the lane that led to the haunted house. In spite of the fact that it was overgrown with weeds and bushes, the boys were able to drive down the faintly defined roadway until at last an rusty iron gate barred their progress. Frank, who was in the lead, got off his machine, kicked the gate open. The rusty chains clanked dismally as they fell from the staples. Then the party went on into the grounds. Under the lowering sky that heralded the approaching storm, the grounds of the Palooka place were far from inviting. Dank, tall grass grew beneath the unkept trees, and thistles and weeds sprouted up in the very center of the roadway. A rising wind stirred among the branches of the trees, and the waving grasses rustled mournfully. Creepy sort of place, muttered Jerry. Wait till you see the inside of the house, Chet advised. Not one of them could restrain a slight shiver of apprehension when at last they came into view of the old stone. It was framed in a mass of trees and bushes and weeds that threatened to engulf it from all sides. Weeds obscured the front door, bushes grew up level with the sills of the vacant downstairs windows. Trees on either side and beyond the house extended trailing branches down over the roof. A shutter hung by one hinge from an upstairs window and banged with every passing gust of wind. A death-like silence hung over the old building. Under the black clouds that now filled the sky, it was imbued with an atmosphere of gloom and terror. Come on, said Frank. Now that we're here, we may as well go through the place. Haven't seen any ghosts yet, laughed Chet with an effort at being light-hearted, but in spite of himself, his tone seemed forced. They left the motorcycles beneath a tree and advanced toward the stone building. The front door was almost off its hinges and swung creakily open at Frank's touch. Frank stepped boldly into the hallway. The interior of the house was veiled in gloom. For the rear windows were boarded up, and the lads could see that everything was deep in dust. The staircase was before them, leading to the upper stories of the building. To the left was a closed door. This must be the parlor, said Frank as he flung the door open. The room was empty. The stone fireplace was one side, and the boys came to the room. A rat scuttled out of the fireplace and raced across the floor, disappearing through a hole in the wall. The sound made everyone jump, for the boys' nerves were at attention on account of the forbidding atmosphere. Just a rat, said Frank. His voice had an effort of calming the others. He stood hesitantly in the middle of the deserted parlor. Joe went over to the window and looked out, but the view from the front window of the Palooka place was so lonely and gruesome, it is in fact tangled trees and weeds and undergrowth under the glowering darkness of the sky. Then he came back. What shall we do next? Said Chet. Nothing much to see around here, said Frank, disappointed. It's an ordinary, dirty, old, deserted house. Let's explore upstairs anyway. At that moment, there was a startling interruption. A weird shriek, quavering as if with terror, rang out from the upper part of the haunted house. Chapter 2. The Storm. That shriek was the most fearful and uncanny sound the boys had ever heard. There was a diabolical malignance about it, like the scream of some bloodthirsty animal, yet there was no mistaking the fact that it was uttered by a human being. As the quavering notes died away, the bare walls of the old house flung back the echoes, so that the shrieks seemed to repeat again and again, but on a smaller scale. The boys stared at one another aghast. For a moment they were dumbfounded. Then Jerry muttered, I'm getting out of here. And with that he started for the door. Me too, declared Biff Hooper, and Chet Morton followed him as they rushed for the doorway. What's the big idea? Asked Frank, standing his ground. Let's stay and find out what this is all about. Joe, seeing his brother remain where he was, made no move to follow the others, although it was plain yet the weird shriek had unnerved him. You can stay, flung back Jerry. I'm not. This place is haunted, and I don't mean maybe. The three boys hastened through the doorway out into the hall and lost no time in regaining the front yard. Frank and Joe listened to their retreating steps. Frank shrugged his shoulders. I guess it gave them a pretty bad scare, he said to his brother. We may as well go with them. I guess so, replied Joe, greatly relieved. They were alone in the gloomy and deserted old house, and as they stepped into the hallway, Joe cast a cautious glance up the stairway. But there was nothing to be seen. The upper floor was veiled in shadows, and the house was in silence that seemed even heavier than before. When the two Hardy boys got outside, they found the others waiting for them in the shelter of some trees about 100 yards from the house. The three were discussing the strange occurrence in excited tones, and when the Hardy boys came up to them, Jerry said, I don't have to be convinced any further. This place is haunted, sure. No other way to explain it. There's not much sense in running away from the sound, Frank remarked lightly. If we had seen something, it might be different. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'd like to get to the bottom of this. It's foolish to run away. Let's go back. Chet Morton and Biff Hooper looked a trifle ashamed of themselves because of their precipitous flight from the house, while the Hardy boys had remained. I just got scared of my life, Chet confessed. Just the same, I'm game to go back if you want to. How about you, Biff? Biff scratched his head reflectively. I'm none too anxious to go back in there again, he admitted. Not that I'm scared, of course, he added hastily, but I don't see where we'd learn anything anyway. Well, Joe and I are going back. That's settled, declared Frank. We want to get to the bottom of this mystery. Mysteries are your meat, observed Biff. Well, when you come to think of it, this is a good chance for a little detective work. He alluded to the fact that the Hardy boys were amateur detectives of some renown in Bayport. They had come by their gift naturally, for their father, Fenton Hardy, had been for years on the detective staff of the New York police. Of late years, he has been living in Bayport conducting a private detective service of his own with great success. He was known from one end of the country to the other as one of the exceptionally brilliant investigators. Joe and Frank Hardy, his sons, were ambitious to follow in their father's footsteps, although their mother wished them to prepare themselves for medicine and law respectively. But the lure of Fenton Hardy's calling was persistent, and the two boys, bent on proving their parents what they were capable of, becoming first-class detectives. They had given proof of this already by helping their father in a small way on a number of cases, but their first big success had been achieved when they solved the mystery of the jewel and bond robbery from the Tower Mansion in Bayport. The story of this had been related in the first of their preceding volumes of this series, The Hardy Boys, The Tower Treasure, wherein was recounted how the Hardy Boys solved the mystery of the robbery when the Bayport police and even Fenton Hardy himself were baffled. I'd rather tackle a good mystery than eat, Frank laughed. And here's one right at hand. Let's go back. Biff Hooper did not care to seem guilty of cowardice by staying behind while his companions returned to the house, and he was on the point of reluctant consent when a matter of suddenly resolved for them by a downpour of rain. Storm clouds had been gathering in the sky for the past hour, and there had been dull rumblings of thunder. Now an uneasy wind stirred the branches of the trees and rustled dismally among the undergrowth. There was a spatter of raindrops, and then the storm broke in abrupt violence. Rain poured down in sheets. "The motorcycles!" cried Frank. Turning up their coat collars, the boys ran through the thick grass until they reached the place where the machines had been parked. "I saw an old shed near the house," called out Joe. "We can put the bikes under cover." There was an abandoned wagon shed near the rear of the house, and towards this refuge the lads trundled their heavy motorcycles. Although the shed was almost falling to pieces, the roof was still in fairly good condition, and the machines were safe from the downpour. "Come on," said Frank when the motorcycles had been placed under cover. "Let's go back into the house." He led the way, running across the open space from the shed, through the driving rain, and Joe followed. The others, after a moment of hesitation, came after them. The back door of the house was open, and the lads ran up the steps into the shelter of the building. There they were in a room that had evidently been used as a kitchen, and although the rain came in slanting streaks through the open windows, the glass which had long since been shattered, they were at least sheltered from the downpour that had assumed redoubled violence. The rain drummed on the roof of the old house and poured from the black skies on the nearby wagon shed. Thunder rolled and rumbled threateningly, and every once in a while a sheet of lightning tore a band of lurid light across the gloom. Chet took off his cap, which was drenched, and tried to wring it out. The others stood by the window, looking out at the terrific downpour. Then came the second shriek. It rang out suddenly at a time when no other lads was talking, and it was a replica of the first, a quavering, long drawn-out yell that seemed to freeze in the blood of their veins. No sooner had it died away when there came a terrific clap of thunder, and then the rain seemed to beat down on the roof of the old house in frenzy. In the gloomy, dusty kitchen, the boys stared at one another. Frank broke the silence. "I'm going to go find out about this," he declared firmly, striding over to the door that led to the interior of the house. "Me too," said Joe. Taking heart by the Hardy Boys' example, the others crowded at their heels. Frank flung open the door and strode into the room beyond. It was a very gloomy chamber. The one window was boarded up, but when their eyes became accustomed to the meager light, the boys saw that door on the other far side of the room led into a hallway. It was evidently not the hallway that they had already been in the front of the house, but presumably one that led to a side door. "Nothing here," said Frank. "I like to find those stairs. That yell came from the upper part of the house." boys made their way across the room. Outside they could hear the sweep of the rain and the steady rumblings of the thunder, for the storm was now at its height. Through the chinks of the boards over the windows, they could occasionally see a lurid glare of lightning. Suddenly there was a blast of wind that seemed to shake the entire house. A sharp, violent noise immediately behind them made every boy jump with surprise. They wheeled about. The door behind them had blown shut. Beth Hooper, who was the nearest, grasped the knob and tried to open it. He wrenched and tugged at the door, but it remained obstinate. "We're locked in," he muttered. "We can get out all right," said Frank. "There must be a door on this side hall." He walked across the room and entered the hallway. At that same instant, a maniacal howl rang through the house. The howl echoes magnified its volume. A flash of lightning illuminated and startled the startled faces of the 5 boys. With one accord, they rushed into the hallway. It was a narrow place, heavy with dust, and their feet thundered heavily on the moldy flooring. Crash! At the far end of the hall, they had glimpsed of falling plaster that fell in a great heap on the floor. A dense cloud of dust arose and filled the narrow chamber. "Run for your lives," yelled Frank, but no sooner were the words out of his mouth than came another ripping, crackling sound from overhead. Immediately above them, a large part of the ceiling, disturbed no doubt by the vibrations of their feet as they ran into the hall, gave way. A wide crack that showed in the plaster quickly became wider, and then with a terrific roar, half of the hall ceiling came tumbling down upon the lads. They were buried in dust and lace of plaster that came upon them in such an avalanche that they were thrown to the floor. The splintering of wood and the ominous crackling that followed indicated that more of the ceiling was about to go, and then came a roar even louder than the first, as another avalanche of debris rolled down upon them. Was the Palooka house falling in? Chapter 3. Empty toolboxes. When he was knocked off his feet by the impact of the falling debris, Frank Hardy crouched down, protecting his head as well as possible until the downfall was over. Although a great deal of rubbish descended, it was not heavy material, and when at last the rain of plaster and splintered lace had ceased, Frank knew that he was uninjured, although he was almost bruised in the heap and half smothered by the thick dust that rose all about him. He managed to get to his feet, fighting his way clear of the rubbish, and the first sight that met his eyes was an arm sticking out of the debris nearby. He seized the outstretched hand and dragged the owner to safety, discovering it was his brother Joe. By this time, the others were beginning to extricate themselves, and within a few minutes, all 5 boys, covered with dust from head to foot, had scrambled out of the clear flooring into the middle of the hall. No one was injured, although Joe and Jerry complained of bruises about the head and shoulders. "Let's get out of here," exclaimed Chet, as soon as he could catch his breath. "I'm not going to fool around this house any longer." He looked about him for some means of escape. "I don't think it's very healthy myself," Frank agreed. He saw a door at the end of the hall and, going over, tried to open it. But the door was locked fast, and although he kicked at it and shoved against the panels with all his strength, he was unable to budge it. "There is a window," declared Joe. "Let's break our way out." The window was boarded over, but the glass was already shattered, so Jet and Cherry picked up some rocks that they had tumbled down in the debris from the walls and ceiling, pounded at the boards. We'd better keep moving, advised Biff Hooper. Perhaps the rest of the place will start caving in on us. There was a splintering sound as one of the boards fell loose, revealing the rain-soaked trees and bushes outside. Another onslaught with the rocks and another board fell away, leaving enough space to admit of a passage of a human body. Gee, that looks good to me. Let's get out of here, quick. That suits me. Don't lose any time, this whole building may come down. As the last words were uttered, the boys heard another crash behind them. It was so close that it made them all jump. Hurry up, everybody, yelled Biff Hooper. Can't get out of here any too fast for me, returned Jerry. You said it, muttered Chet. One by one, the boys scrambled up the window sill and squeezed their way out between the boards until at last all were standing outside the house. The storm was still raging. Rain poured down in drenching torrents. Now let's get away from this place as we can travel. Let's get as far away from this place as we can travel, said Jerry. Somebody is going to get killed if we stick around here too much longer. And he was pale with fright, and it was plain that the strange experiences of the past hour had completely unnerved him. That's the way I feel about it, agreed Biff. I'm not a bit comfortable around here. Let's beat it. I'd like to find out what is wrong with this place, persisted Frank doggedly. You couldn't drag me back in there with a team of horses, objected Chet. Let's clear out. I've had enough of it. Come on, urged Jerry. There's no use going back. The whole place will cave in on us if we aren't careful. And anyway, there's something fishy about this place. Frank saw that the others were determined on leaving, in spite of the pouring rain. So reluctantly, he gave in, and the five boys hastened around the side of the house over the shed where they had left the motorcycles. We can at least stay in the shed until the rain goes over, he said. Not on your life, declared Chet Morton. I'm going to put as much distance between little me and that haunted house as I can. That place gets on my nerves. And with that, he began tinkering with the machine, preparatory to starting it. Frank and Joe decided that no good would be served by arguing the matter. So they prepared to leave with the others, although they privately resolved to return to the Palooka place at the earliest opportunity to investigate the mystery of the house on the cliff more thoroughly. Jerry and Biff Hooper took their places, and in a few minutes, the three motorcycles drove slowly out of the shed across the yard towards the lane. It was then that they heard the laugh. From the haunted house came a harsh, mocking laugh that rang out in peals of derisive merriment. It continued for several seconds, and it could be heard quite plainly even over the noise of the engines and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Then it stopped abruptly. The boys looked at one another. Did you hear someone laugh? Asked Frank, unable to believe his ears. You bet I did, exclaimed Chet, and that does settle it. I'm leaving here right away. That was the most nerve-wracking laugh I've heard in my life, declared Jerry. Let's get out of here, quick. Somebody's playing a joke on us, Frank said angrily. I'm going back. Joke nothing. That place is haunted. Come on. And with a roar, Chet's motorcycle leaped forward as he headed down the lane towards the main road. Joe, looking behind and motioning to his brother to stay with the party, followed him. Soon the three motorcycles were speeding down the lane. From the haunted house came peal after peal of the same demoniacal laughter, as though mocking their flight. Then, as they rode through the streaming rain and the haunted house was lost to sight among the wet, sodden trees, the laughter died away. When they reached the main road, the boys turned their motorcycles in the direction of Bayport. and for more than 5 minutes the machines rocked and swerved as they sped along through the muddy ruts. The boys were soaked to the skin, and rain dripped from their peaks of their caps into their eyes. The rain poured down with redoubled violence, and the others could scarcely see Chet's machine through the misty downpour. Chet was making such good time back to Bayport that they found it difficult to keep up with him. Frank Hardy was still dissatisfied. He really wanted to remain behind and probe the mystery of the house on the cliff further. He held no stock in ghost theory. The shrieks and the mocking laugh, he was sure, were some human origin. But what could have been the motive? It may have been that some boys had been in the house when they arrived and simply seized the opportunity to play a joke on them. In that case, he muttered to himself, the story will be all over Bayport High School by Monday, and we'll be kidded within an inch of our lives for running away. We should have stayed behind. Something told him, however, that this was no ordinary schoolboy prank. The incident of the falling ceiling had unnerved him slightly. It was only good luck that none of them had been seriously hurt. Of course, it may have been entirely accidental, but it seemed to happen at the strangely opportune time. Then the recollection of the shrieks and the mocking laugh came back to him again, and he shivered at the recall the maniacal intensity of the tones. If it was any fellow like ourselves, he was a mighty good actor, Frank said to himself. I have heard of a person's blood running cold, but I never knew what it meant until I heard those yells. Suddenly his motorcycle began as he turned it, acting up. A cough lurched, backfired explosively, and the engine died. What a fine time for a breakdown, Frank said as he dismounted. Joe drew up alongside. What's the matter, he called. Engine broke down. Gosh, aren't you unlucky? Exclaimed Joe, grinning. There is a shed over at the side of the road. Bring it over under cover there. He pointed to a tumble-down shed nearby. Frank realized that it might take some time to discover the trouble, so he trundled the motorcycle to take refuge his brother had indicated. In the meantime, Chet Morton looked back to find that the others were not following him, and he decided to turn around. The roar of the machine could be heard through the rain as he rode back towards them. In the shelter of the shed, Frank first of all took off his coat and cap, which were dripping wet, and hung them up on the projecting board. Then, as Joe and Jerry stood by, glad of a chance to get out of the rain, he rolled up his sleeves and prepared to find the source of the trouble. They could tell Chet was calling for them as he drove along the road of the rain. He thinks we're lost, laughed Joe. He went over to the front of the shed and hailed over their companion. Come on up here, he shouted. Had a breakdown. Grumbling audibly, Chet dismounted and came over towards the shed. In the meantime, Frank had opened the toolbox of his motorcycle. The others were startled by the sudden exclamation. Frank was startled at the toolbox and bewildered expression on his face. My tools, he exclaimed. They're gone. The boys crowded around. The toolbox was empty. Did you have them when you left Bayport? Asked Joe. Of course I did. I never go anywhere without them. Who on earth would take them? You can have mine, offered Joe, going over to his motorcycle. He snapped open the toolbox on his machine and then gave a shout of excitement. Mine are gone too. Chapter 4. The Chase in the Bay. The boys stared at one another in bewilderment. I know my toolbox was full when I left home, said Frank. And so was mine, came from Joe. I was using the pliers just before we started out. Where could they have gone? They must have been stolen while the motorcycles We're in the shed at the Palooka place, Chet suggested. It's the only time they could have been taken, declared Frank. It was the only time that they were left unguarded. Joe was frankly puzzled. But we didn't see anyone around the place, said Jerry. No, but there was someone there. We heard the shrieks and the laugh. Someone stole those tools while we were in the house. It's some kind of practical joke. That's what I'm beginning to think, declared Frank. Let's go back and get those tools. Not on your life, objected Jerry decisively. This is a little too much. First of all, we hear those shrieks, and then the house almost comes down around our ears, and now we find the tools have been stolen by someone we didn't see. We're safer away from there. Biff Hooper nodded in agreement. That's what I think. There's something odd about that place. We'll get into trouble if we go butting into any more. But we want our tools. Good night, Chet exclaimed. Perhaps mine are gone too. He ran over to the shed over to the road and hastily examined the toolbox on the machine. Then he straightened up with an audible sigh of relief. Thank goodness, they're here. Guess whoever took them, others figured he had enough. I'm going back, declared Frank. If you do, you'll have to excuse me, Chet said. You're welcome to use my tools to fix up your machine, but I won't go back with you. Me neither, chimed in Jerry and Biff simultaneously. Joe and Frank were silent. They wanted to go back to the Palooka place and investigate the matter further, but they didn't want to break up the party, so they decided it would be better policy to remain with their companions. All right, Frank said. Lend me a pair of pliers and I'll have this trouble fixed up in no time. He went over to Chet's motorcycle and got the desired tools. Then he began to tinker on the machine. It was only a minor defect, and within a few minutes' work sufficed to repair the damage. In the meantime, it was apparent that the rain was letting up, and by the time the Hardy Boys took their motorcycles out of the shed and regained the road, it had died away to a mere drizzle. This has been some holiday, Chet muttered as he mounted his machine again. I'm going home. Jerry, you and Biff had better come up to the place for dinner. How about you, Joe and Frank? Thanks, just the same, but we couldn't. We promised to be back home this afternoon. There's a side road that turns off here that makes a nice shortcut to our farm. I guess I'll go that way. There should be room for 3 on this bike with a little crowding. Jerry and Biff Hooper clambered on the motorcycle with Chet Morton and started off. The Hardy Boys followed on their own machines until they reached the side road about 100 yards away. There the others left them after shouting goodbye. Frank and Joe watched Chet's motorcycle, heavily overloaded, disappear into the mist that hovered over the road, and then they prepared to continue their journey back to Bayport. The shore road dipped at the point where it wound down along the edge of the bay to a deep spiral, which brought them to a point almost back to the cliff at the top where the Palooka place was located, although by now they were near the water's edge. From there, the road sloped directly down to the shore and then ran along the edge of the bay and towards the city. Frank looked up towards the top of the cliff that loomed above them. They could not see the Palooka place from where they were, as it was on the high ground and almost masked by trees, but the mystery of the place still preyed on their minds. I'd like to go back there yet, said Frank suddenly. That affair of the tools has me guessing. Me too. But I think we'd better go home. We can always come back another time and look for them. 1 minute, I think it was only a practical joke of some kind. The next minute, I think something a whole lot deeper than that. There's something strange going on up there. There's sure There were sure a lot of strange things going on when we struck the place. That's certain. I can hear those shrieks yet. Well, I guess you're right, Joe. We may as well go home, but I'd like to go get to the bottom of it. Whoever stole those tools made quick work of it. We weren't in the house very long. It proves that it wasn't a ghost anyway. I never did believe in the ghost theory. No, some human took those tools and he was watching us too. He saw us put the bikes in the shed and took the tools while we were in the house. Unless they were taken after we left the bikes under the tree in the first place, he wouldn't have had time. We only stepped into the front room, and then they all came out after the first shriek. No, the tools were taken when the bikes were in the shed. The boys rode on. The rain had ceased now, but the road was greasy, and they had to call on all their skills to keep from skidding as they drove down the steep road of the bay, so they did not talk again until they reached more level highway at the shore. A sound out in the bay attracted Frank's attention, and he looked out over the rolling sweep of waters. He could see a powerful motorboat plunging through the waves about a quarter-mile out. It was just coming into view around the base of the cliff, and as Frank looked, he saw the nose of still another boat emerging into sight. Each craft was traveling at high speed. "Looks like a race," remarked Joe. The Hardy Boys stopped their motorcycles and watched the two boats, but it was soon apparent that there was no friendly speed contest. The boat in the lead was zigzagging in a peculiar manner, and the pursuing craft was rapidly overhauling it. The staccato roar of the powerful boats was borne into the lad's ears by the wind. "See, the other boat is chasing it," Frank exclaimed. He had caught sight of the figures in two men standing in the bow of the pursuing craft. They were waving their arms frantically. The first boat turned as though it were about to head into shore at the cliff, and then apparently the helmsman changed his mind, for at once the nose of the boat pointed out into the open bay again. But the moment of hesitation had given the pursuers the chance they'd wanted, and swiftly the gap between the racing crafts grew smaller and smaller. The Hardy Boys saw that there were but one man in the foremost craft. He was bent over the wheel. In the other boat, they caught sight of one figure who had snatched up an object that appeared to be a rifle. To their amazement, they saw the man aim the man in the lead craft. Then, across the water, they heard a sharp report. The lone figure in the first boat dropped out of sight. Whether he had been hit or not, the boys could not tell. But the craft did not slacken speed. Instead, it continued in its race madly through the waves. But the pursuers rapidly drew closer until at last the boats were running side by side. They were so close together that it appeared as a collision were imminent. "The whole crowd of them will be killed if they aren't careful," muttered Frank. Then, just as it seemed that both boats might crash together, the pursuing craft, as though it had given up the chase, veered abruptly away and headed out towards the middle of the bay. The speed of the other boat decreased. The roar of the exhaust became intermittent. "Engine trouble," suggested Joe. But there was more than engine trouble. With startling violence, a sheet of flame leaped high into the air from the motorboat. There was a stunning explosion and a dense puff of smoke. Bits of wreckage were thrown high into the air, and in the midst of it all, the Hardy Boys, horrified, saw the figure of the man they had noticed before as he was hurtled into the water. The whole boat was swiftly ablaze. Hardly the wreckage began to fall back into the water with spasmodic patterings and splashes. Then the craft was in flames from bow to stern. "Look!" Frank shouted. "He's still alive." The man of the boat that had been killed by neither rifle nor explosion. They could see him struggling in the water not far from the blazing craft. His head was dark oval in the water, and he was slowly trying to swim ashore. He'll never make it, gasped Joe. We'll have to try to save him, answered his brother. And that was the first 4 chapters of the Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. I don't know about you guys, but I'm enjoying this new Hardy Boys adventure. Next week, we continue with Chapter 5, The Rescue, here on Accessibly Live, the Book Club Reading Room. Thank you guys for tuning in. We appreciate it, always. We do this every Sunday night, and we also do this on, as you know, Twitch and YouTube. So if you can't see us on one, check us out on the other. We do this every Sunday, normally live on Twitch at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. But we do play this back here on YouTube as well. And I appreciate you guys watching. Give me a yell. Let me know where you guys are watching. JoelK_OG at Comcast.net. We are going to get going and wrap the show up. It was a good show, and I'm glad you guys were here along with us. Once again, we remind everybody, if you get a chance to send me a signal, like and subscribe, hit the like and subscribe button. And we are excited for the upcoming season of Accessibly Live. A lot of new books, a lot of special things coming up here on the channel. We do 2 shows. We do this show, the Book Club Reading Room, and we do the Conversation Station on Thursday nights up from the other studio. Hope you guys like the library. I want to do this and continue doing this for you from here and give you a little more opportunity to be kind of in a library theme. Next week, as always, the next 4 chapters of the Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. Now, before we go, we do here on this channel, in this show, something similar to what we do on the end of our other show, the Conversation Station. At the end of the show, we do a final quote for the night. And tonight, the legendary writer, director, author, comic book writer, J. Michael Straczynski, had a good quote. And with what's coming tomorrow in the world, we'll see. People spend too much time finding other people to blame, too much energy finding the excuses for not being what they are capable of being, and not enough energy putting themselves on the line, growing out of the past, and getting on with their lives. It's a good quote. With what's coming for the next 4 years, it's a good thought. It's a good thought for everyone to kind of contemplate. People spend too much time finding other people to blame. Too much energy finding excuses for not being what they are capable of being, and not enough energy putting themselves on the line, growing out of the past, and getting on with their lives. J. Michael Straczynski, the man who gave us Babylon 5. You guys take care of yourselves. This is Accessibly Live, the Club Reading Room, every Sunday night here on the channel. I appreciate you guys watching. Be well, be safe, be kind. For those of you experiencing really nasty weather in the northern parts of the U.S., southern half, torrential snow, bitter cold, we keep our thoughts for everybody who's lost so much in California. Be Be well, be safe, be kind. Look after each other, guys. It takes a family. It takes us to work together. We'll see you next week for the next 4 chapters of The Hardy Boys, House of the Cliff, here on Accessibly Live, Book Club Reading. Take care, you guys.